Are you somebody who's finding it hard to understand what is SSR, CSR, ISR, SSG? Do these terms make no sense to you? Well, I'm going to explain to you what these mean by helping you understand how to eat food. Let's get into it. But first of all, thank you so much for joining. My name is Shruti Kapoor, your favorite developer, entertainer, and content creator. I have been coding for 12 years, and honestly, I relate with you. These terms are confusing. So let me break these down for you. But before we get there, hit that like button now. Hit that subscribe button now. Thank you for your support. Now let's get into it. I think it's helpful to look at how HTML and CSS is delivered in each of those rendering strategies. So let's take a look at them. First, client-side rendering. Now, imagine that we have the client and the server that need to communicate with each other. So the client needs to make a request over to the server. It says, give me a homepage.com. And at this point, the server needs to deliver the JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, which imagine the files look like this. So in client-side rendering, we've got the server that gives a index.html, which is not complete. It's a blank page. There's a script.js that still needs to be executed on build time, and style.css. Server then delivers these files to the client. The client now has to process the script.js file, execute the JavaScript, and then finally this is what makes the page interactive. Once the JavaScript is executed, the page is now interactive. Index.html is populated with the new components that were generated. This is, imagine that you have React. On the client side, the React is going to run, and then your components are generated, are run, and now client is ready to show the web page to the user. So who's doing all the work here? The client. This is client-side rendering. Now you can imagine what the pros of this approach could be. Because the client is the one executing the JavaScript, which means that we have control on when the page becomes interactive, and this kind of rendering leads to highly interactive applications. This is traditionally the approach that React applications have, single-page applications have. And because we have control over when JavaScript executes, which is on the client side, as soon as the user interacts, we can execute their function, and this leads to real-time updates. But a problem though for client-side rendering, as you can imagine, is the JavaScript needs to be executed on the client side. But if you're sending a lot of JavaScript, it means the initial load is going to be slow because the client has to do a lot of work to execute that JavaScript before the page becomes interactive. Another problem is because the server delivers an initial shell of an HTML, it is not good for SEO. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we have server-side rendering, where the server is the one doing most of the work. So again, client needs to send a request to the server that it needs a home page. The server understands that it needs to send JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. But at this point, the server has script.js, and it's actually going to execute the script.js on server itself. And once the script.js has executed, index.html is now complete with the content from the JavaScript file, which means that when it is sent over the wire, the file is ready to be displayed. So once the file is sent over to the client has to do no job because index.html is complete, and all it's going to do is just render the page. So no work for client side. The advantages of this approach is that client has to do less work. So even if you have a lot of JavaScript that you need to execute, server is the one that's doing a lot of the job, so the client has less load. Because the client has less load, it also leads to fast pages as well. And thirdly, because on the server index.html is complete, it leads to a good SEO experience because the crawlers now understand the content of the page. But what is the disadvantage of this approach? As you saw, that the server has to actually execute the JavaScript and create the HTML, it's possible that that JavaScript is stale, or perhaps the index.html is stale. So every update requires a rebuild of the JavaScript bundle, leading to sometimes stale data. So not super good for interactive components. Another disadvantage is that we saw that we have to fetch a request from the server for homepage.com. Imagine if you change the route and now go to /products. If we have server-side generated content, the server has to now generate content for that new page as well. Therefore, page transitions or going between multiple pages can be slow because for every request, we have to talk to the server and wait for that data to come back. Now, we talked about the two different ends of spectrum, where on one side, we put all of the content on the client side and let the client do all the work, whereas on the other side of the spectrum, we have the server doing all the work. There's pros and cons of both approaches. But is there something better we can do? Remember one common theme between two, where somebody has to execute the JavaScript and generate the index.html file. Imagine if you're fetching the same index.html file over and over again. Maybe there is some way of caching that so that you don't have to generate that index.html file over and over again. And this can also work if you have same type of products that you want to show in an e-commerce site. Or maybe you have images that you want to cache. At this point, we can leverage something called static site generation, which kind of benefits from caching approach. So in this, what we do is remember that we have to deliver index.html, script.js, and style CSS files to the client. Now what we do is, instead of giving these files from the server, we can actually deliver these files from a different computer, which is called the CDN, Content Delivery Network. Now what's cool about this is that this Content Delivery Network, or CDN, can actually be a computer that is very close to the user, which means the time it takes for them to get their response back for the request is a lot less than if the request had to travel all across the world. The way this works is that we actually duplicate the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files and put these files on the CDN. So now if the client has to request homepage.com, we can simply redirect their request to actually get it from the CDN. And the delivery time is much faster than if they had to get it from the server. Once the client receives the files, it's ready to go. It doesn't have to do anything. What's cool is that we can have multiple CDN servers and the response can come back from a computer that is the closest to the client. So what do you think are the advantages of this approach? Given what I've taught you so far, pause this video for 1 second and put down in the comments of what you think the advantages of static site generation is, of this approach is. Pause the video, put it down in the comments. As you can imagine, we don't have to wait for either the client side to execute the JavaScript or the server side to execute the JavaScript. The JavaScript, HTML, and CSS is ready for us, which means that this can create super fast websites. Also, the time it takes to get back the response from the network is a lot faster because we're getting the content from a computer that is much closer to us. And because we are offloading the work onto a different computer, the server can now do something more important or more urgent, thereby leading to reduced server load. So the server is free to do other stuff. And finally, there is ISR, Incremental Static Regeneration. What this aims to do is solve the problem with SSG, which is that the content could be stale. What incremental static regeneration does is that your static content incrementally regenerates after a given period of time or after a condition has been met. Let's take a look how. In Next.js, we can provide a parameter called revalidate, and when this is provided, Next.js knows to invalidate the cache after every 3600 seconds. So it will invalidate every hour and make sure that the user is getting a new request, a new page, that the user is getting a fresh build of the page every hour. What you could also do is that imagine that you have a create post function, which is you added a new post. At that time, you could invalidate all of the previous posts you have so that the users see the most updated posts. Now, out of these 4 approaches, which approach you choose depends on some of the requirements you have in mind. None of them is a wrong choice. Oftentimes, CSR or client-side rendering gets bad repo. But the truth is, in certain cases, client-side rendering is the right approach, whereas in other cases, client-side rendering may be an overkill. So here are 5 things you need to keep in mind to understand which of these approaches work for you. Number 1, build time. which is how long does it take for your JavaScript bundle to build. Now imagine that your bundle takes too long to build on the client side. It means that your client will be waiting for a long time. So can you offload some of that on the server? Number 2, interactivity. Because in client-side rendering, the app is immediately interactive once we've executed the JavaScript, this can lead to highly dynamic websites. What does interactivity mean? The user clicks a button, something happens, maybe there's a pop-up, the user enters something, you submit the field, you show to the user some of the data that they entered. This is interaction, which is a user interacting and the website responding. Client-side apps are perfect for this. So think about which parts of the app need interactivity and which parts are static content that you can put on the CDN. Thirdly, search engine optimization. Is the part of your app important for SEO? And if it is, can you put it on the server? And finally, real-time updates of content, which is how fast do you want your content to be updated? If this is something that is static, like a blog, which is never going to be updated, static site generation is perfect for it. Whereas if it is something that only needs to be updated every few days, for example, a product details page, maybe incremental site regeneration is the right approach, where you put content on the CDN, but after 4 or 5 days, you update the content. So those are 4 different things you have to keep in mind to pick an approach. Now, the good thing is that you don't have to pick one over another. You can actually have hybrid rendering. Here's an example. Imagine that you are on an e-commerce site like Amazon's page and you have the details of that product that you're looking at. So you'll have a product details page. You'll have a product details component. Now, because this component will fetch information about pricing, about the specifications, about maybe images, this kind of content needs to fetch other APIs, which means that this kind of processing can actually be done on the server. So you don't have to call APIs from the client side. This can be an SSR, a server-side rendered component. Then you might have other products that are similar to that product. Typically on Amazon.com, you'll see at the bottom there'll be a related product section. That kind of content doesn't change very often. Or even if it changes, it can be changed after a few days. This kind of content can be SSG, statically generated, and you can put it on the CDN. And then finally, you have a component at the bottom which has all of the reviews that you want to see. As you post a review or as you rate a product, you want to see that interactivity or you want to see that interaction right away. You want to know that your review has been posted. This kind of component is perfect for client-side rendering. And Next.js makes this very easy for you by giving you some methods. So for SSR, you've got get server-side props. For static site generation, you've got get static props. And then for client component, it is the use effect that we currently use in React. And if you want, you can actually make it a little bit better by using stale while revalidate, which is use SWR, which means that your reviews get immediately posted, but you kind of hold on until fetching more and more reviews. This makes for a better load performance on the client side. Now, to really understand each type of rendering, let's actually take a look at some code. Now, here is that product details page that I was talking about. This is a hybrid rendered page in the sense that the product details, which is this thing, is rendered fresh on every request. It's rendered on the server. Why? Because we need to call an API to check for the price. We need to check how many items there are in stock. And so it's important that this information is as updated as possible. And therefore here it says on every request it is updated. So if I reload this page, that time updates. Then at the bottom we were talking about similar products. This kind of content can be pre-rendered because this type of content doesn't change a lot for a specific product. So this content is statically generated. And finally, at the bottom is the content that needs a lot of interaction. For example, writing customer reviews. Because if you're writing a customer review, Shruti Kapoor, You want to see this right away. Therefore, this kind of stuff is perfect for client-side rendering. And how do we do all of this in Next.js? Let's take a look at the code. Now, this repo is going to be linked for you in the description, so check that repo out. But here are the 3 products that we created. We've got the product details, which is server-side rendered. We've got similar products, which is server-side statically generated. And then finally, we have client-side rendered product. Before we dive into server-side rendered product, let's actually take a look at similar products, which is statically generated. Let me show you where the similar products comes from. In this folder, I have a library. I have a data file, data.js, and this is where I'm fetching similar products. I've got a statically written data set. In Next.js, there are 2 ways of doing static site generation. Next.js, you can statically generate pages with or without data. In our case, because we have static data, we're not fetching a data. By default, Next.js pre-renders pages using static generation without fetching data. For example, which means that if you're not calling an external request, that page is going to be by default statically generated. So for us, we have to do nothing because in similar products, we're going to provide it a static content, a constant content, a static content, and that's all we need to do. So in this page, you'll notice that we don't do anything else. However, if you were fetching external data, for example, calling a CDN, you could use get static props to tell Next.js to statically generate that page. So here's an example. Let's say that you're fetching blog posts from somewhere. Maybe you have stored that HTML in CDN. You do need to fetch posts. And in this case, you can create a new function called get static props and export this function from your component. And that is all Next.js needs to know in order to know that this is a statically generated page. Okay, so static generation, easy, because if you have static data, you don't need to do anything else. But if you don't have static data, then you can use something like, get static props. What about server-side rendered? Let's take a look at product details to understand that. Now for product details page, you notice that I'm passing in a product in here. Let me show you where that product is coming from. I have created a new async function here called get server-side props, and every time this page reloads, I'm fetching in a new product. You can imagine this is where you would call your database or call a fetch request. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a product, and on every reload, I'm fetching a new product or I'm updating a new product. And for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to update the last updated to be the current time. So how does server-side rendering happen? Notice in this component product details, I'm passing in a product. Where is this product coming from? If I scroll down, there is a function here called get server-side props. This is how I tell Next.js to fetch this on every request. In this function get server-side props, I'm telling Next.js that this component needs to be updated on every request. And what I'm doing here is I'm updating product, and I'm updating its last updated to be the current time. So I'm basically modifying a product. But you can imagine that in a real use case, this is where you would be calling an API. And when I provide this product back into this props, Next.js knows that part of this props product comes from server-side rendering, and the rest of it comes from static data. So that is server-side rendering. To recap, in order to do server-side rendering, I can use get server-side props. Finally, client-side rendering. In client-side rendering, we actually do what we've been doing so far. We've got use states, we've got use effects, and we're fetching an API at this point. This is all rendered on the client side. This is business as usual. So to recap, server-side rendering can be done by get server-side props, static site generation can be done by get static props, and CSR or client-side rendering can be done by business as usual use effect. Did that even make sense to you? If so, here's a pop-up question for you. What does SSR, ISR, SSG, and CSR stand for? Put that down in the comment section. By the way, if use effect is a hook that you don't understand, watch this video next. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, keep coding and remember, you belong here. You're meant to be here. I'll see you soon. Bye.